Shadow copies of shared folders utilizes the Volume Shadow Copy Service, or VSS, to provide a means of maintaining previous versions of deleted or modified files on a Windows file server. These previous versions may then be accessed and recovered when data retrieval and file recovery becomes necessary on the file server. This feature is great in a network environment where many users use the same file server and edit the same files. It is easy for them to make mistakes and delete or overwrite each other's work without actually meaning to. VSS has certain limitations. 1. It can only be enabled on a per-volume basis, so it affects the entire partition where it is configured. In other words, you couldn't configure it on a subsection of that partition or volume, like a folder. 2. It requires a minimum of 300 megabytes of space on the volume to store previous versions of files and can appropriate a maximum of 3 gigabytes of storage for this task. The default value is 10% of the volume where VSS is installed. 3. A maximum of 64 shadow copies, that is previous versions of a file or folder, can be stored on a volume configured with VSS. After this number is exceeded, previous versions are deleted and replaced starting with the oldest saved versions. 4. By default, each day shadow copies will take 2 snapshots of the VSS volume, one at 7 a.m. and one at 12 p.m. This means that each day you get 2 copies where you can go back to previous versions. You may modify this and take more, but remember this shortens your 64 copy limit faster. 5. You can enable shadow copies on a system volume, but this is pointless because you cannot restore previous versions. You should only enable shadow copies on non-system volumes where you can use the restore function. Today we're going to implement shadow copies, which gives you a way of creating previous versions of files in your file servers. So if your users inadvertently delete a file or change something, you can go back. And by default, it'll make 2 shadow copies a day. At 7 a.m. and 12 p.m. and also by default you need about 300 megabytes of hard drive space, as a minimum for keeping previous versions. You can allocate more, but when you run out of space, what happens is that shadow copies will go back and start deleting the previous versions or the least or recent copies of things that were saved or copied. So to set this up, you're going to need at least 2 hard drives. And the reason is, I'm going to open up my computer here, but yeah, I could right-click and I could go to Configure Shadow Copies and I could configure it on the C drive. But if I did, although I can enable it on the C drive and I can create a shadow copy, I can't revert. Watch what happens if I try to revert. It'll tell me a volume that contains operating system files or resides on a clustered shared disk cannot be reverted. Okay, so as a minimum, I'm going to go ahead and delete that and disable that on my system drive. As a minimum, you're going to need at least one other partition, and actually really you want a separate physical drive to get some decent performance out of the tool. So I'm going to configure and enable shadow copies here on this drive, data, given the drive letter E. I'm just going to go configure shadow copies, and I'm going to go enable, and notice that when I do that, it automatically creates a copy there. And right now I don't have any shares, so I'm going to click on OK. I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of shares here. On this folder, I'm going to make one share and call it Data 1. I'm going to make another share and I'll call it Data 2. So I'm making the folders. Now let's go and share them out. So advanced sharing, check everyone, full permission, OK. Security, edit, add, everyone, full permission, OK. And now let's do the second folder. And sharing, and I'm going to add, in this case, everyone, give them full permission. And on the security tab, same thing, I need to give everyone full permission. Alright, remember that when it comes to network shares, the effective permissions that a user has are the combination of what they, the access control entries, that is discretionary access control lists that they have, the local permission on the security tab, as well as the share permission. It's the most restrictive combination of the two. So if I'm going to give write access across the network, then they need write access on both the local permission and the network permissions or share permissions. So with this set, again, if I go back and look at the computer, go back here and go to shadow copies, notice now I have 2 shares that are being protected. And I'm going to go ahead and create one now. Okay. So I have the option of manually creating one. And I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And now I'm going to hop on a Windows 7 workstation, and we're going to create some files. So I'm on my Windows 7 workstation now, and I'm logged in as Adama. That's the user. And I'm going to go to my file server, which is the Pegasus, running shadow copies. And here are my two shares. And I'm just going to make some files in this folder here. So from across the network, I'm just creating some files. Now let's hop on over to the our file server, and we'll manually create another shadow copy again, because I left it at the defaults, which is like 7 a.m. and 12 p.m. and we don't want to wait that long for this short video. So to the Pegasus. I'm back on the Pegasus, my file server, and I'm going to go ahead and look at the shadow copies tab here. Okay, and now that I've actually made some changes, I'm going to go ahead and create another shadow copy here on this. So I'm just going to say create now. Okay, and now that I have, notice that in this case it was 3:32 p.m., which was the current time that that shadow copy was made. All right, and if I want to look at previous versions, I can go here and I can open, and notice now in my shadow copy I can actually go back to those previous versions and restore them if need be. So if I were to go here, and I could actually copy these, I could access them, I could use them, but they're now available to me. If I want to, I can restore, I can copy to another location, or I can open and browse. So let's just do a restore here. Okay. So just kind of a brief look at shadow copies there, and a very useful feature on a network.